Hello everyone. We're going to take a quick time out from our sequential videos to take a look at a composition I recently finished up and talk about how you can use just one FX chain to really impart a limited amount of timbrel variance and just a lot of fun. Now, you guys know that if I have the choice between doing something genre specific or doing something very experimental, I'm probably going to take the experimental route. Now, in this particular example, what you're going to see with this really long and complex effects chain is something for this composition specifically. However, the underlying principle, the underlying idea here is going to be relevant to everybody, and I'm going to talk about that after we walk through this particular effects chain, how this idea is really important to everybody's music, especially if you're doing electronic music. So here was the effects chain I built, and if you haven't seen the composition I recently finished up, you can check it out. I'll link to it in this YouTube video. And if you're not into experimental music, that's totally fine. You don't have to listen to it all the way through. What I would recommend is just jump around to a couple of different points in the video so you can hear all the variants and timbres that I was able to come up with. And I did this all from just one FX chain. And the track itself is just a blend of noise, resampled white noise, and a Wagner prelude. All right, so that's all it is, and then all I did was make one crazy effects chain, and I set up a bunch of macros to help control some of these different parameters in here. So right off the bat, when you look at it, it's just a simple effects chain. Okay, nothing going on. If I try to play back, we're not going to hear anything, and we'll see why that is as we go through this. So to start, I have an LFO. All right, so this LFO is at the very top level of the effects chain. And this LFO can then be nestled with additional effects, additional LFOs, additional layers. There could even be effects chains inside of here. That's the beauty of this software, is that you can really drop anything wherever you want, which means that you have so much control over different effects and where they're going to fall in the signal chain. So we can see at the very start, I have a reverb, and I have a control for the reverb right here inside of my macros of the LFO. If I turn this up, we're still not going to hear anything, and that's because somewhere down the line, I've obviously dropped an FX layer. And the effects layer gives us the ability to process our sound in a parallel configuration. So even if I have 50 chains, if they're all turned down to 0, we're not going to hear anything. So I have a reverb here, I have a step mod, I have a resonator bank, I have a couple of different ladder filters, a delay, a few more filters, I think, after this, and another effects chain down here, and then I have a final low-pass filter. And so to control these, I would say, major effects, I have controls here with my macros, my low pass, a high pass, my delay, my verb. And when I was actually performing this, I specifically mapped something to this frequency cutoff here at the very end, and also to this mix knob here. All right, so if we go through and look at this, okay, we can see that there's some effects nestled in some of these places, but we're still not finding that effects chain. That's located here inside of this step mod into an LFO, going into this effects layer. And then of course, within the effects layer, I think, let's see, where did I put these macro controls? Probably in here. From here, I can actually control the levels of these various chains here. So if I turn up the bypass, we should start to hear some noise coming through. And now my bypass chain is the chain that has no effects processing on it specifically. All we have here is a tool device. But that means that from the macros at the very top, I should still be able to impart some quick changes because these are going either before or after the step mod. Right? And you can hear as I'm moving that filter around, we're actually hearing that go into the delay, and that was intentional. I put my filters, a couple of filters before the delay, so if I was making changes to the filter, we'd be able to hear that then run through that delay there. Where this starts to get interesting is with my other effects chains. So inside of my low, I have an effects chain, and then I have a bunch of different effects going on in here, all culminating with this XY effect. And this is where it starts to get interesting. So now with the XY effect, you can see that inside of each of these, I have a different series of effects. So if we go in here and turn up the low, I have control of the X and Y plane here. I also have a resonator bank that's at the end of all of these effects. And so if I wanted to, this was specific to this composition, I have that resonator bank tuned to a very low F note. And we'll be able to hear that here. And I did the same thing for the mid and for the high. All right, in each of these, I have control over the XY. We can see that in some of these, I even have additional LFOs, etc., etc., etc. And then at the very end, these ones I don't have macro controls for, but let's just play in a little bit of all of these different sounds here. Even the bypass, why not? I have a couple controls at the very end to add even a little bit more variation. And then I obviously have a low pass filter to turn everything down at the very end, which is what I did in this particular composition. So what we can see here is this is really taking the idea of the effects chain and the effects layer to whole new heights. It's really pushing the boundary of what you can even do here. You can see our DSP is about 50%, so we could still have taken this a lot further. We could have added more chains if we wanted to do that. Obviously, if I was to go any further, I probably would have confused myself, and even just looking at this, it can be fairly confusing. But how is this important to those of you who are working on genre-specific music, especially electronic music? Well, it comes in variation. So the reason why it's really easy for us to listen to somebody playing a guitar and singing just, an acoustic guitar and either a male or female vocalist on top is because with the human voice and with live performance, there's constant variation. There's a human factor to it. There's imperfections, and those imperfections are what keep us interested. The human voice especially is such a dynamic and powerful and rich and variant instrument. Nothing really even comes close. With a guitar, yeah, there sure is a lot of variance you can do, but nothing like the human voice, mainly because we talk every day, we sing every day, and by doing that, we start to pick up on all the nuances and things we can do with our own voice. In electronic music, a lot of times we're stuck to the grid, and if I had $1 for every single beginner producer who started out by making a really cool bass sound, making a really cool lead sound, making a really cool pad sound, making really cool drum sounds, arranging a track, and then being super disappointed, usually the reason for that is because they have no variation in those parts. And because these are static parts to begin with, it gets boring, it gets repetitive. There's nothing that the listener is grabbing onto to keep their attention throughout the track. So although the intro, the 8-bar, 16-bar intro might be banging, when you start to just hear those same loops over and over again, it loses some of its appeal. And inside of Bitwig Studio, having the ability to have an effects chain, an FX4, or whatever they call it, an XY effect, is going to give you an ability to come up with a whole lot of different variations. And I'm just going to show it to you quickly here. So I just used this preset. If you guys looked at my last project there, obviously you could tell I wasn't using presets. I was doing very specific things to try to suit that composition. But in this case, we have the polysynth just playing on its default. And listening to that over and over again is probably going to start to get kind of boring. All right, so what we could do, and this is something I would kind of encourage you guys to consider, obviously build up your own of these, but you can drop an XY effect on here. And what you have control over are all of these different locations, all of these different spots. And every single one of these spots is going to give you a different timbre. So if we just listen to it. Right? And this is taking it to an extreme, but the concept is what's important. What you could do is you could obviously go into the actual automation of the clip and you could change things around, or we could go here from the arrangement view, which is just going to be a little bit easier. I'm going to open up the XY. I'm going to click the X and I'm just going to make a few different points. So let's put that one to 49. And I'm just doing this with the start of each note here. Okay, cool. So we can listen back to this now. And just like that, we're getting some timbrel variation. Now this is taking it to quite an extreme, and really we'd probably put this down a lot lower. And if it was a bass sound, we probably wouldn't be using flangers and choruses and all of these other things. Maybe for a lead or a pad, this might work a little bit better. But again, this is all about just the concept of getting that immediate variation from note to note or from part to part. So I think that there's kind of two schools of thought about how you go about getting variation. One is to sit down and make like 100 different patches, or not 100, but a good handful, a good 8 to 10 different patches, and then think, okay, where can I put these different patches in the track so I can have that variation? The other approach is to just pretty much design 1, 2, or 3 sounds and then make a bunch of different effect racks and XY effect devices, and then just modulate, automate, and change the positioning. And when you do that, you're going to start to get all sorts of different variations and changes, and you can work this on a very subtle level, note to note, all the way up to part to part. So you might have a different sound in your chorus versus in the verse or something along those lines. Now we can actually take this a step further if we want, and we can review something we talked about in an earlier video, and that's having the program itself introduce some of that randomness for you. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm just going to delete all of these automation points for right now. Let's pull this back real quick. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put an LFO at the front. Here, you guys have seen me do this before. I'll drop this right in. I'm going to change this to sample and hold. I'm going to put this to time and beat. 1 bar, correct. And now I'm just going to use this to change these points and even the mix at random. And And now what you're going to want is, because this is just one LFO making these changes, we're not getting as much variation as we'd like. These are moving together, which in some cases that might work well for you, but maybe not in all cases. So I can add a second LFO at sample and hold. And again, I'm going to put this to 1 bar. And this one I'll actually use on the Y. And let's just go. And now we could take a listen to this. And you can make that as subtle or as obvious as you want to do. So I thought I just would show you guys that there's a lot of power in doing some experimental practices like I did here, taking this one FX chain and really maxing it out so I could get a whole lot of different timbral variation, to also doing something that's going to be very practical for your own music. And when it comes to variation in electronic music, it's like peanut butter and jelly. It is that important. Thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.